Chapter: Any Map Without Paradise. Spliff awoke on a soft bed. He didn't know where he was, and this caused anxiety. His heart started racing. The room was as dark as the mine. He stood and groped randomly, knocking over a ceramic cup which shattered on the floor. Then the door opened and the light of a lantern flooded his face. His eyes rolled into the back of his head. When they adjusted, he saw a face he didn't recognize. The face said his name and called for others, and then there was Tycho and the elf Miniwuna. They urged him to lie back down, and he sat, staying upright, feeling disoriented. Tycho explained Spliff was in his home. Toppler had gotten him back up the slope, and Tycho had directed them to bring him here. This made sense, and Spliff was grateful. His mouth was dry, and he asked for water, and Min dashed out to get him some. They hooked the lantern to the wall and brought in another, and Min also brought back some breakfast of stewed oats and berries, which Spliff gladly accepted. After breakfast, his spirits were high. Spliff felt surprisingly good. He asked if Toppler's assistant was all right, and she was. He patted the bandages on his back, which tingled to his touch. Then he got around to asking on the general state of things. "I know we didn't discuss it, but we've executed a plan that's essentially foolproof," Tycho said in a political voice. Spliff responded positively, asking for more details, and when more were given about the closing of the gates and erecting of barricades, Spliff had to think. Finally he asked, "What of my sister and her kids?" "I sent someone to their home, and it was empty. I'm sure they went underground in one of the other counselors' bunkers." "And they have enough resources?" Spliff asked. "We've stripped the market of remaining foodstuffs. The humans will undoubtedly starve first." Spliff nodded, then looked at Min, who was being sheepishly quiet. He asked her what it was, and she looked at Tycho, who shrugged, so Min told him, "I've been keeping tabs on the barricade, and yesterday your sister's husband and one of the Iondine daughters ran up to the gate. Balain was confused what they were doing there. Apparently they were under some misapprehension we needed help, and they were captured. In our rush, perhaps not everyone was properly informed of the plan," Tycho said, his political side making Spliff uncomfortable. "I just wanted to make sure you knew," Min said sympathetically. Spliff thanked them both and laid back down on the bed. They both agreed to leave him be and get some rest. Spliff nodded, but in reality he just needed to think. He felt plenty well rested. He felt surprisingly good, the best he'd felt in a long time. His mind was clear, and he wanted to do something with this feeling. Not do in the classical sense, where his will might be exerted in one direction or another. He was overcome with the sense that this feeling had, for lack of a better term, its own mind. As he laid on the bed, he was repeating a line from one of the adventure stories he'd like to read and distract himself with. He'd curl up in some boarding house room and stay in bed for 3 days eating honey cakes and reading about adventure. He'd loved this line and committed it to memory. Any map without paradise isn't worth looking at. He loved the idealism, but it was like he'd never felt the love before this very moment. He felt like he, for the first time, knew the feeling of love which was written about in books. It was a love for the idea of life, the truth of life. Nothing hidden, nothing too dangerous. All life was important and equal of love. Spliff stood up from the bed, opened the door, and walked upstairs to the main living area where Tycho, his wife and one child, Min and a couple other gnomes were sitting and chatting seriously. Spliff smiled at them all, bowed, turned, and opened the door to ascend the slope. Miniwuna sprang up to a crouch and followed. At first she said nothing, followed softly. But her longer legs allowed her to catch him, and she walked by his side. "I don't often talk about my home," she began. "Really, I don't have one place I call home. There was the place we stayed when my mom got too sick. Anyway, we weren't a family of many traditions." Gnomes look at me and imagine a culture as hard as ironwood, but that is not life for every elf. I let them believe in the mystery. That feels better than my jealousy. I'm jealous you have a place worth fighting for." Spliff stopped, looked up at Miniwuna, and took her hand. "This is your place now, too." Spliff looked around. "It's everyone's place. We have been very narrow-minded. We thought we were protecting ourselves. I'm as guilty of it as any other Yome. I thought I needed to protect this place from itself. It's silly." Spliff began walking again. "Where are you going?" Min asked. "I want to see this barricade for myself." "I promise it's secure. We've got a rotating guard," Min said. Spliff said nothing and continued walking. When they reached the gate, he stopped at some distance and asked if she knew where Francis was. Min had to search her mind. The Druid? The big beard." Spliff nodded, and Min admitted to not knowing. "And my sister is still in there, and Falcior, and Popheme, the witch, and Francis. Don't ask me to feel bad for Falcior, that liar." "But don't you see everyone's been lied to?" Spliff said, his heart glowing. "The blame is equally spread, me as much as anyone. For that reason alone, I can't let anything bad happen to them, not while I have breath." Spliff began walking towards the gate. Min reached out and grabbed his arm. "Wait, hold on. They won't let you through." "Why not?" Spliff asked, perfectly naive. "Come, sit with me. Let's have a conversation, and you can tell me your concerns." Miniwuna hadn't partaken of her beloved herb in many days, and the caretaker codependent part of her personality had been rearing its ugly head. Well, slightly less ugly now, not feeling as much like an outsider, the structure of her days having literal impact on the possibilities of dependence being reciprocal for her. Some resident carpenters had fashioned benches with longer feet on one side to be propped against the facade of homes, places for their impromptu militia members to take a load off or eat their lunch. They took the less used bench on the far side. The guard detail was light this morning, a dozen gnomes with blowhorns hanging around their necks to signal the others. There were sounds of metalworking as more long spears were being smithied to stick through the gate and fend off the final desperate attempts of the soon-to-be starving humans. It was interesting how a few short battles had formed a closeness between these two very different individuals. Already Min could tell that Spliff's mind was made up. She wanted to spare him or dampen the harsh reality. Even with his mind made up, the situation would not change. "There are very strict orders about the gate. Everyone knows them," Miniwuna began. "Oh, I believe in us, Min," Spliff joked. "Us," she laughed. "What makes you think I'm going to help you? Even if we put aside getting through the gate, why would I endorse you walking into your death? That is all that's waiting for you. Seriously, my friend, what could you possibly accomplish?" "All you and I ever wanted was the truth. The truth is, all of those beings in there made this truth happen." Spliff pointed at the gate. He continued, "There's no real villains in life. Is it possible I die? Yes, it is possible. But any map without paradise isn't worth looking at." Miniwuna gave him a sympathetic smile for that line, but then rejoined, "First of all, there are villains. I've had encounters with them. Calumny is a villain. He only thinks of himself. Well, that's true of everyone," Spliff interrupted, then waved her on. "Secondly, this isn't a plan. I don't understand what you're going to do." "I'll make peace. We just have to wait." "I think that's naive," Spliff said. "Even if I'm wrong, their attack will fail. We have all the advantages." "I wouldn't be so sure about that. I think a heavy boulder would roll right through," Spliff continued. "In any case, that's not my goal. I want to live in the truth for the rest of my days. If that's only one more day, so be it." Min almost laughed at the frivolity of the sentiment. She also respected it deeply. She felt a love for Spliff, two individuals bound together through a shared moment. She couldn't lose him or reject his vision. She would be his companion, even though it was completely irrational. The irrationality made it even more compelling. Rationality had no relationship with love. She took his hand. "All right, I'm going with you." Spliff looked up at her and smiled so wide, pinprick dimples appeared on his freshly scrubbed and bruised face. He looked like a kid who'd just accomplished a major personal scheme. He kissed the back of her hand multiple times, and she laughed and ran her other hand through the dirty curls of his hair with its dignified gray strands. "It's not going to be easy to convince them." "Who's that?" Spliff continued smiling. "If we're going to do something silly, I feel like I should have my loot." Sadly, it was all the way back in her shack. "Do you think it's important?" Spliff asked earnestly. "No." She squeezed his hand tightly. "So you know what you're going to say?" "Yes, vaguely." Spliff shook his head from side to side and smiled again. Together they did convince the militia to open the gate, though they were tried to talk out of it a dozen times. Even Tycho was summoned to talk sense, but he could see a glow behind Spliff's eyes. The humans were not visible in the marketplace, and a quick opening was deemed safe. One of the militia gave Min his blowhorn, and though she could only get 2 notes, the sound was like music. And in the back of her mind she was already composing a score for a play with a blowhorn as the main instrument. A play about redemption and freedom. Chapter: Alchemy. In the morning, Calumny forced himself upon her, and Popheme wondered about the last time she'd ever have sex. Would she know it was coming, this last day? Or would it be a day like today? So repulsive. She would have to take a bath just to get the smell of his breath off her neck. So awful she would simply never again choose it. Anyway, she hardly considered this sex. It was like making breakfast or any other routine which had to be accomplished so the day could progress. He was so solipsistic, and she realized she didn't even have to fake enjoyment this time. She gently touched his shoulders and whispered a single line of encouragement, so soft in voice even she wasn't sure of the words spoken. As they got dressed, Calumny spoke first. "I need your help, and I need the rest of the crystals I sent up to you." Popheme gave him an evil look in the middle of making her tea. "Unless, of course, you'd like to starve," Calumny said. Popheme was very reluctant to give up any of her stash of atheramite, let alone all of it. "What's your plan?" she asked, pouring the tea. "I think we blow the gates over. With what one of those canisters can do, you should have enough for the equivalent of 100. Popheme sat at her desk and sipped her tea and didn't look at him. Calumny was perturbed by this non-response, her arrogant demeanor. "We can use the gnome prisoners as shields. Walk them in front as we wheel the device up. I have it all planned out," he continued. "And do you have a plan if an explosion that large does damage to the structural integrity of the mountain, and we all die under rubble?" Calumny cocked his head to the side, thinking, "That won't happen." "And why are you so sure?" "Well, why don't we try 20 first, see how that goes?" Popheme felt bile rising in her stomach. She turned to look at him. "I was impressed when you learned how to make the canisters for yourselves. I wrote the instructions in such a way even an idiot or a fool would be able to follow. Still, you surprised me." Calumny said nothing, but his face hardened. Popheme continued, "Do you know what the art of alchemy is? It's the art of things which were never supposed to exist. I know, as much as I teach you, you won't understand this, but let us pretend for a moment. Here, in any case, we have the relationship between the two of us. Such a thing only happens when one party is an alchemist. You are not destined for this life. I made all of this happen, and you do not get to tell me what I am or am not going to do." "So you want to starve," Calumny said obtusely. "Let's just say I'm not willing to risk anything based on one of your plans." "All right, and what's your idea then?" Calumny said. How many of the gnome homes have you searched through? Many. And you've recovered no foodstuffs, Popheme asked. Some? Then I say we wait. Dig into all their secrets and have a complete picture of what we're dealing with. Then, if nothing else comes to mind, we can try and blow the gates down. Calumny turned away from her gaze reluctantly. He knew she was right. Still, he said over his shoulder, I think we should get working on it anyhow. Better to be prepared than not have it when we need it. Fine, Popheme agreed reluctantly. You needn't insult me either, Calumny said, trying to not betray his hurt feelings. I am aware of the nature of our relationship. Popheme drank down the last of her tea. It was better to not disabuse his conception. Let him believe he was aware. After he'd left, she continued to ruminate on all those things which were never supposed to be. The acts of gathering knowledge had no ties to certainty. She could have expressed this with more subtlety to her useful brute. After all, she'd spent many years as an educator operating under the assumption more knowledge was better. Didn't matter whose ears it fell into. However, during those years she'd learned that most ordinary minds couldn't handle the uncertainty long enough to achieve true alchemy. She was trying to talk herself up. One way she'd found of doing so was by acknowledging the simple steps required. Alchemy was a process. She was not special. She could do these things and others could too, even though she knew they couldn't and wouldn't. She'd spent too much time close to those with power to want any political power for herself. Politics was not involved with creation. Politics wanted the things which didn't yet exist to stay in non-existence. Wanted people to be only pawns. Popheme liked to think she thought more of people than that, but she was in the middle of performing the most daring and complex alchemy ever attempted. It was an unfortunate necessity that some would be sacrificed. She ignited the black disk and put it under her teapot for another cup. She walked over to her chest and pulled the leather strap with a grunt across the plain rug it was sitting on. She folded back the rug and uncovered the wood plank to reveal her crates of ethereumite. She removed a vial, stood upright, and sprinkled some into her teacup. She barely felt the psychological effects anymore. She wondered if she would have a hard time not ingesting the powder once the baby was born, if she would have a physical dependency. She didn't worry too much on this count. If that suffering came, she would deal with the pain then. She emptied the rest of her vial into her ornate personal bottle and sealed it with a corkstop and sauntered back to examine the stash under the floor. She understood roughly how to create the type of blowout Calumny had been asking for, but admittedly, part of her hesitancy was genuine uncertainty about an ability to make one big expulsion. She could link together many smaller explosions, and in close enough proximity this would probably do the job, but there was always a chance of failure. And worse yet, she didn't want to waste any more of this precious material in destruction. It was meant to create life, create time the human race had never heretofore conceived, a cosmic consciousness where a being might have a conversation with the sun as equals. Well, maybe that was a bit much, she smiled to herself. Perhaps the blowout device might do its best work, rigged as sabotage. Could she convince Calumny he would have to light it himself? She cackled, imagining the surprised look on his face right before he blew apart from the assemblage of reality. No, he'd have no time to make a face. Make a face, make a face. What she'd been doing her whole life, making a face for others. She'd gotten tired of being a functionary, being sane. Sanity required a consistent reaction to functionality. She wanted to play around in the space of the insane, those who had reactions to the truth. The truth is what was possible, and she was defining the new insanity. Popheme rubbed her belly gently, filled up her teacup, anxious about her excitement to have fresh ethereumite back in her veins, back in her blood, forming that little body, the first real witch in human time. Chapter Falcior's new friend. Observing the kitchen in the mansion which would never again be his, Falcior watched an insurrectionist, with a particularly bad haircut, even for a bachelor miner, emerge with a large pot of steaming spiced beans. He put the pot on the worn dining table where Falcior's guard had so often eaten meals. Falcior looked around the room with absent longing. He wondered why he had returned to this place. Of course it was where many of them ended up. He didn't fault those of his ex-guard who he saw getting bowls of beans in their familiar spot. But for him it seemed asinine to return to this place. It was like going to the whorehouse to sleep on a couch. It would be less painful to sleep on the street than be reminded what you were missing. At first, Falcior's play had to be around Calumny as much as possible. Let him get used to Falcior as a non-threat, even useful. Lull him into complacency. But then, Falcior had to ask himself, what comes next? Finding no real answer, he drifted into the rock garden where he'd grabbed a wicker chair and was sat observing the main hall passively. The goons clomped up and down into his old room like it was a rite of passage. Perhaps they were pissing on his bed, but he had no heart to look and see. He was going to sit in this chair indefinitely. The miner with the horrible chopped haircut and facial hair which had unnoticed long strands in random places under his chin and high on his cheeks came over to Falcior with a bowl of beans. "You should eat," he said. "I used fresh ground peppercorn." He leaned in yet closer, conspiratorial. "It's good at masking certain flavors." Falcior looked up at the rebel suspiciously. The familiar way he was talking with him was clearly strange, but also his eyes were different from the other miners. Less cloudy, more moist. Back to the kitchen, a lot of mouths to feed. Even as he walked away, there was something about the gate, now that Falcior was paying attention. He took a bite of the beans and raised his eyebrows in pleasant surprise at the flavor. Not thinking, he stood from his low chair and walked towards the kitchen, catching looks both mocking and ashamed. In the abandoned and messy kitchen, he saw this strange cook, bent over the coals of a fire using long prongs to turn root vegetables charring in the heat. Falcior watched for a while until the man started pulling them out, and noticed Falcior stood watching him. The man smiled, said, "For digestion, bitter roots are best." "Do I know you from somewhere?" Falcior asked, rightly suspicious now. "That depends," the man replied, pulling out the last white and black charred veg. "Where is somewhere? And what does it mean to know? Do I know myself from somewhere? Or am I merely a mask covering the great yawning emptiness inside?" Falcior was annoyed now. The man knew he had no power and could string him along like a little boy. Still, he took another bite of the beans, and they were quite good. Instead of being combative, Falcior embraced the silence. He took a beat and went through the catalogue of every individual he'd met since arriving in the mountain. This was a trick he'd learned playing games of chance, since knowing his opponent's style and weaknesses were as much a part of the game as anything. Then suddenly it clicked. The bad haircut was too fresh. Francis, isn't it? Falcior took another bite of beans, hiding his smile. Francis frowned. This both ruined the game, and perhaps his disguise was not as good as it had appeared. This adjustment in perspective immediately coincided with a shock of pain in his shoulder, and he grimaced, rolling the arm back. But Falcior ignored this. He felt happy. He was pleasantly surprised somebody was doing something. What was the Druid doing? It hardly mattered. Falcior needed a reminder that cleverness and trickery, resistance, was still an option. "I'm happy to see you, if happiness is still allowed." This was not morose on Falcior's part. It was quite like an exaggerated politeness, acknowledging his own failures and the current misery, asking if he, himself, was worthy of being happy. Francis picked up on this humble demeanor and felt redeemed. He'd always hated plans because of their capacity to fail. But then again, there were the little redemptions, and the narrow but exciting possibility the plans might actually work. Not that anything about this could be considered a real plan. If a plan was like a clock with intricate gears in motion which needed to happen precisely, that was not to his strengths. The long view of nature was predictable. But the intricacy was not supposed to be discernible. Such attention to intricacy actually took away from the larger conceptions of life and purpose. "Have you ever had the feeling," Francis began, peeling the charred skin off of fennel root, "timing might be everything. Even the things you were supposed to know could only be understood when you were ready to understand them?" "Honestly, I'm not sure," Falcior continued after a long pause. "When knowing ceases to matter, then you have to trust your instincts. By trade, I was a gambler. What I learned from gambling is the people who can't stop are those who secretly like not knowing." Francis cut a large chunk of fennel and chewed. It was difficult to express feelings. Again, he was back on feelings and their lack of proper names, and thinking about Popheme. "I think the only one who can help us now is your alchemist. Have you talked with her?" Falcior replied definitively, "No." "You should." Francis's mouth was half full and his words expelled steam from the veg. He waved his hand round. What's his name is sleeping with her, you know." Falcior looked confused. Francis knew he would have to explain more, which felt like gossip, and he hated to gossip. Then again, maybe in all his life he'd never understood the point of gossip. In this case, he could definitely see the point in telling Falcior everything he knew. But maybe other people, too, considered gossip essential. But he didn't want to talk himself out of explanation now, by refusing to be like everyone else. He told about Calumny and Popheme's conversation when he was in the room, and Falcior's interest was so intense, he jumped with fright when Mikhail came into the kitchen with another basket of hard veg. Francis reassured, and Falcior recognized one of his guard, who he'd barely spoken to. How quickly they had all deserted him, and how normal this desertion had felt to Falcior. This was the feature of games. When the game was finished, the players stood and went their own directions. In a way, it made him feel pleased with himself to see others' actions align with his predictions, even if these actions weren't to his benefit. He didn't fault any of his guard, though Mikhail gave his old boss a wide berth in case any random ire might be expressed onto him. The man who had called himself Falcior tried to continue as if they had not been interrupted. "You know what you're suggesting? That Qualia orchestrated this entire thing? For one, I find that hard to believe. Two, if you are correct, how would me going to talk to her change anything?" Francis began peeling more veg. I don't know. She seems tough, but sometimes I get the sense she doesn't know what she's doing." Falcior smiled. Some vague joke about women sprang to mind, but he wasn't one to talk. He sighed. "Perhaps none of us do." "I have half a plan," Francis said. "Which is?" Francis grimaced and rolled his shoulder again. "If we have a big dinner, we can get them high. I have just enough medicines to do so, probably. We run to the gate, tell the gnomes we have an advantage, and hope they believe." "Might be less than half a plan." Francis shrugged in agreement. Falcior's mind started to tick over. There had to be genius locked away inside him. He'd come this far. None of his success was by accident. Then he got distracted thinking about Qualia's betrayal. Had she a secret agenda this whole time, and he missed it completely? Not such a genius after all. Had she used him from the very start? Was his whole conception of reality flawed? Falcior, Bragadine, felt woozy. He leaned forward against the wood preparation table to steady himself. Francis and Mikhail exchanged sideways looks, preparing to catch him if necessary. Returning to his old name, Bragadine, he felt cold inside. small. He asked Mikhail if he might not go to his room and grab his coat, the puffy white robe. It was hidden under the false panel at the foot of his bed. If he was going to lose, might as well do so feeling and looking like the man he'd made. He noticed Mikhail looked to Francis for a positive indication, the strange hermit not even looking up from his peeling veg. So even this request his old guard wouldn't do for him, personally. It was too much to be ashamed. Bragadin gave Mikhail an elaborate thank you as he left. He felt on the verge of shivering. "I need to get this straight," he said to Francis. "She taught them how to make those things, those cylinders. She told them to come overthrow me. Why? I don't understand what made her so unhappy." "I don't think it had anything to do with you." Francis paused, cutting veg. He wasn't sure how to say these next words sincerely. "She wants to give birth to a god." Bragadin couldn't process this information. He felt the way information might while being processed. Chewed and snapped and zapped with lightning. He thought about the word loyalty, but he was too smart to take loyalty as permanent. He'd heard many talk of loyalty, and it always came from a place of insecurity. Any words which followed the word loyalty were asinine. "Where's the loyalty?" or "You're just not loyal," were accusations for those who hadn't figured out how to properly placate by pleasure. In short, these were lazy leaders. He'd become lazy, complacent. He'd shuffled off all the real responsibilities and missed the motives happening right beside him. Mikhail returned with the white coat, and Bragadin thanked him honestly. He put it on and contemplated how he could return to being Falsior. "I'm saying," Francis continued, "you need to go talk to her. That's the only way we're going to fill out—" Francis stopped talking mid-sentence as a half-dozen goons came into the kitchen. They had clearly followed Mikhail and the coat. They looked around and asked what was going on. The leader goon stood next to Falsior and said, "You know, I really like that coat. Why can't I have that coat?" Bragadin mulled over this strange phrasing in his mind. Obviously, this had been a bad idea. Still, why can't I? "So you take orders from this guy, huh?" The lead goon asked Mikhail, who shrugged and tried to play it off by looking for another knife to start cutting veg. Bragadin only had one play left, and that was to put on the character of Falsior. He turned to the goons. "You can have my robe if you answer a riddle." The goons snorted. One said quick, "Trout, that's the taste of your mother's cunt." Falsior nodded, solemnly. He had to speak or he'd lose control entirely. "Tomorrow is the day of the future, and yesterday is the day of the past. Both words acknowledge a construct about the passage of time, yet one is right and the other wrong. Why?" "You wanted a why question. Here you have one." The goon pondered a moment. "It doesn't make any sense." True, Falsior thought. He'd made it up on the spot, but he didn't give anything away on his face. He was buying time, unbuttoning the compartment in the pocket of the coat where a small blade could be gripped between two knuckles. How many guesses do I get?" the goon asked, playing along for now. "As many as you'd like." Francis was hoping this interaction didn't bubble into violence. He still wanted Falsior to talk some sense into Popheme. Maybe she'd run away with him. A delusion Francis didn't want to look at closely, that he'd fallen in love somehow. At the very least, he wanted her alive. The goons gave utterly random guesses to the riddle, purposely obtuse and profane. The situation was becoming unruly, difficult to understand for Francis. As attuned as he was to feelings, his own, he never much liked them. Some people, he'd learned, trusted their feelings, acted on them as if they were benevolent guides. What made Francis act was very different. The long view, that was the Druid's way. He could feel the feelings bubbling, and he needed to see some logic in the stew. This was not courage. Courage was a feeling. This was anti-feeling. It's a trick question. Francis put on a gruff intonation on his words. They're both wrong, 'cause neither exists. He's trying to make you a fool. Francis pointed the short knife at the fake wizard. Give him the coat. I got your riddle and we've got you. Now give him the coat. Francis was trying his hardest to sound menacing, even though his goal was the opposite. Bragadin felt stubborn about not wanting to give up this beautiful piece of clothing. The lining was puffed silk and the fur was so perfectly soft. He rubbed it between his fingers for the last time. He was alone. He could not take them all down with the tiny blade in his knuckles. He took off the coat and handed it over, and miraculously the goons left, fighting over who got the coat. He looked over at Francis and Mikhail, who gave him sympathetic looks and audibly sighed relief, and Bragadin felt a quick reversal. No, he wasn't alone. The Druid had guessed right about a play he was being stupidly stubborn about. The right move was to fold. Still, he was cold. So he moved closer to the fire and crouched in front. Mikhail handed him a crate of veg, and Francis instructed him about the amount of char they wanted on the skin. After another half hour of work and letting their emotions settle, Bragadin had to ask, So this is all for tonight? You're going to poison them all tonight? Well, I wouldn't call it poison. I don't have poisons, Francis said. Bragadin rolled his eyes. It doesn't have to be tonight, Francis continued. I should make sure that they want to eat my cooking. In the meantime, like I said, go talk to her. If all of what you told me about her is true, I don't think I have anything to say. Francis contemplated this. It was his problem, too. He didn't know what to say. Perhaps it was all beyond words. What would it mean to be beyond words? Only action? No, most actions were the manifestation of words spoken inside one's head, or commands when one finally got tired of themselves. To live beyond words would to become an animal. It sounded nice, like why he'd been attracted to transmogrification in the first place. Perhaps it was finally time to transform, though he lacked the same potions. Could he use only his will and the knowledge he'd acquired? He'd have to leave these new friends behind. Did he make friends? Francis wasn't at all sure he knew what the term friend meant. Self-sacrifice, maybe, at its best. What would he have done for Melilin? Practically everything and nothing. The good part of friendship meant there was nothing in it for anybody. It was pure. Somehow. Though something needed to be shared. If nothing else, an enemy. And at least here they had that. Again, Francis thought about his conversations with Pophine. She was wrong about hermits and happiness. They, like anyone else, expected too much from happiness. The hermit was just looking under different types of rocks. They set themselves more achievable goals, and this was because the hermit, himself, had failed to become ordinary or extraordinary. Radical simplification was necessary. He looked at the fake wizard and now understood him as a brother who had also failed spectacularly. Francis's failure had been purely internal and thusly more private and less embarrassing. He couldn't imagine how it felt to be this Falsior character and lose the entire identity. He felt like saying something about this to the fake wizard. I spent most of my young adult life, every day, basically, distorting my mind and expecting nothing, and yet wanting to squeeze life into my head, wanting every day to be a fun adventure. I wanted and wanted until it became obvious wanting was oblivious to everything. It's a gift, I think, to finally realize wanting isn't you. Bragadin absorbed this monologue, doing his best to push down the part of him which felt everyone who tried to give advice was being condescending. He nodded his head and then had a flash of inspiration, thinking back to the qualia he knew in the capital. How in the quiet moments, like when they would read together, She might look up from the pages and stare off into space, and he so often had the feeling she always wanted to be someplace else. She wouldn't want to be here anymore, either. "Thank you, Francis," Bragadine said earnestly. "I think I know what to say." Francis waited, blinking his eyes, because he thought the fake wizard was going to tell them. So did Mikhail, who asked indignantly, "What?" And Bragadine left the kitchen abruptly to go speak to Qualia. Chapter: Ordinary Magic. Bragadine looked over his shoulder one last time, making sure no one was following him before opening the door to Qualia's room. Though she wasn't startled, she did not speak. Finally, she said aloud it was all right, and her gnome servant revealed herself from underneath the chaise lounge. Looking around, Bragadine felt odd, realizing he'd never before been in this room. She kept a lot of secrets from him. He hadn't wanted to know. The furnishings, the books, the giant painting of a Gothic castle. The room filled him with affection. Reminders of being alone in her room so many years ago when they had been pupil and teacher. "No magical lock on the door? Any idiot could waltz in here," Bragadine said. Pofim gave a reluctant, heavy eyelid smirk. "And yet, it's your first time. It's a good thing I never wasted my resources. What do you want?" "Why do you assume I want something?" Bragadine asked. "The same reason I might assume a dog sitting by my table is looking for food. This is a very low bar for assumption. Again, I'll save my assuming for something more worthy of my resources." "Feeling protective of your resources, are we? That's the best time to bet big," Bragadine said. "I don't know the game," Pofim rejoined. Bragadine drifted further into the room and let his eyes linger on the painting. "I think you do. I think you invented it." She was surprised he wasn't dead. She hadn't wanted him dead, had never asked for it, but one of her assumptions was his death. Then again, he'd always been good at talking people into and out of things. "So I'm the last left to blame. It must have been me, not the thugs and brutes stomping around this place. Come pick on the woman, 'cause you have nobody left to blame but yourself." Bragadine grimaced. The accusation did land, but it was her defensive tone and what he knew of her machinations. He'd always thought better of her. Perhaps she believed him to be merely fishing and truly unaware of knowing the facts. Why not? There was no reason for him to know. "I'm surprised you aren't in shackles somewhere," Pofim continued. "An oversight?" Bragadine asked the question, looking her directly in the eyes. She was becoming suspicious now. He was too confident, too demure. She asked her gnome to make them a pot of tea. Bragadine said, "So you're comfortable with all this. I wonder why they've left your room alone. They treat mine like the local tavern." "Well, you are more centrally located." "We're both alive. That's interesting, isn't it?" Bragadine asked. "I imagine we're still useful. How will they stay in charge? He knows you have connections to the king." "True," Bragadine acknowledged, "and yet we've still yet had any conversation of the kind. Makes me think he's already worked out a deal. I just don't know how. Or perhaps he's done nothing of the kind. Like true brutes, they rushed in with swords regardless of the consequences." "Oh, please," Bragadine said, exasperated. "Let's knock it off. You know I know better than that. You really are treating me like an idiot. I don't want to sound naive, but I thought we were friends." Pofim stood and received her cup of tea. Bragadine was handed one as well by the gnome servant, who promptly left the room. "You scared her off. This is supposed to be a safe space." Her words had a lilting irony. "Don't you think we should have a plan to get out of here, Qualia? Even if he's indulging you now, do you think that will go on forever?" "He's indulging me? Other way round, I should think. Well, now you're giving yourself away. How? Popheme laughed with the subtlest inflection of insecurity, and Bragadine was beginning to be frustrated. He really didn't have any moves beyond sentimentality, so he dove straight into the well. I took you for granted. I did. I'll admit it. I never thought you had grand designs. I thought you wanted a place where you could be completely and utterly yourself. You can be yourself in a shack. What's the point of that? Popheme rejoined snappily. I still remember so many of the things you told me. I remember when I thought I might learn some magic. You told me the ordinary is more magical than expertise. Everything in the world is contained in ordinary things. Expertise looks in one direction and misses the magic right in front of their eyes. Do you remember saying that? They were both standing, both holding their teacups with two hands, like duelists for a niche competition called competitive cup holding. Whether or not I did is irrelevant. It sounds like me, I suppose, Popheme said. Bragadine pushed ahead. Remember when we were trying to decide what we should do with this new metal? I remember your idea. I remember the moment so clearly because you read from an old scroll of mathematics, and it said, the test of originality for an idea is not the absence. He looked proud of himself for remembering and then stumbled. Is not the absence of a predecessor, but the presence of multiple incompatible ideas. Ideas are a melding of multiple different notions which have never been smithied together. I knew you were the right person to ask, but you made it all click in my mind. You are a good teacher. The flattery was finally having its desired effect. She was softening. This melding is what she had done inside herself. Years of study, combinations of ideas, and he was seeing it, reflecting her internal idea of herself like a mirror. She tried to avoid her vulnerability, the possibility still her plan might not work. The trouble with creation, it had its own plans. She would not give in to this vulnerable feeling so easily. She needed to guide the creation, needed her daily dose of atheromite. She also realized she was being manipulated. She couldn't help the fact that it had worked on her emotionally, but she could know and acknowledge his tactics. I'm sure I've told you before, Braga. Popheme sat on the couch and crossed her legs. There is a fundamental difference in us. I was born poor. For you, knowing, learning, was a game. For me, it was life or death. I was always going to know more about the ordinary. Perhaps, after this, you will too. There's not many who get to say they played a god and be telling the truth. Your memoirs will get you access to any court in the world. Only if we get out of this first. Bragadine was blowing past her condescending tone. He drank the rest of his tea and set down the cup. Popheme sighed. You'll be fine. If you're not dead yet, I don't think he's going to kill you. What a relief. It strikes me as odd you hadn't considered this as being a possibility. I know I didn't walk you through it, but I had imagined more from you. All that free time and no backup plan? Bragadine gritted his teeth. Now, stop it, Qualia. Your attacking my feelings will do no good for either of us. It's cruel. So leave. I did not summon you, and frankly, Braga, I don't see how conversation will get us anywhere. If you come to me with a plan and a direct way I can act in that plan, fine. Otherwise, she waved her hand in a shooing motion. Who had she become? Bragadine yelled at himself. Had he created a monster? Letting her in on his scheme and she could treat him this way? He looked at her like she was a dangerous predator, one he'd somehow been lulled into thinking would never attack him. Was this due to some overestimation of himself? Thinking himself very special? Yes, of course. He knew this and he didn't care. He was special. It was the only reason she was forced to treat him like this. No part of his musculature was allowing him to turn and walk away. His nervous system was activated and it was telling him to fight. His tongue searched in his mouth for the words higher than the expletives he wanted to yell. I know, Qualia. I know you're behind all of this. You expect me to believe those tools figured out how to turn the Aetheromite into weapons all on their own? It's disrespectful. You can't talk to me like a peer, your collaborator. You're going to need me. When the king finds out about this, who's going to cover your ass? He'll send a legion after you. Even if you outlive me, your days are numbered. I don't understand. I don't understand. He was trying to turn her weakness for explanation against her. Like when she was a teacher and explaining, she'd get lost in her thoughts. Maybe he could hit her over the head and tie her up and hold her for ransom. If the Druid was right, Calumny valued her body. Bragadine was trying to turn her spiritually back into Qualia, and this was neither in her interests, literally or figuratively. She felt she had become Popheme. She was past the ordinary. It was so obvious, and here he was trying to drag her down like a drowning man trying to fight for his last breath of air. It was pathetic. Braga, the familiarized name, dripped with condescension. You've lost. There's nothing to be done. I don't care what you think you know. It doesn't matter. The blade he'd taken from inside his old coat stuck out an inch from his knuckles. It was so small he'd left it tucked between his fingers on the walk over. He'd practiced sleight of hand and felt comfortable in his ability to look natural. He'd kept the outside of his right hand out of her line of sight. Now he dashed at her and closed his fist, and he covered the distance quickly enough that though she tried to get up from the couch, he shoved her back down and held his fist with the blade in front of her eye. His breath was heavy. She said nothing, and he wanted to pierce a hole in her throat. Maybe the apologies would spill out from her windpipe. And he laughed to himself, a crazy laugh. He knew it looked crazy, and he leaned into it until the laugh became false, and he stopped suddenly. He told her to lay on her stomach. Slowly she complied. He searched the room frantically with his eyes, looking for anything to tie her up. She turned her head to the side so she could speak. Braga, just go. Find somewhere to hide. You're not a fighter. He'll come back here and kill you. The door to the room opened. Popheme's gnome servant poked her head in as if she'd been waiting outside for any sound of distress. This sobered Bragadine, as if the gnome had cast a spell releasing him of his anger. It was ordinary magic. Perhaps, yes, maybe, perhaps he could learn from this moment. For a long time, Bragadine had become tied up in the extraordinary. But even the Druid had realized all he needed to do was shave off his beard and put on different clothes. Bragadine was clutching for his power, and all he was grasping was air. No, you're right, Qualia, he said, turning towards the door. I can't say I wish you the best, but I think I still think better of you than you think of me. The gnome servant held the door open as he walked out. Popheme rose back to sitting and rubbed her forehead. She was tired of men. Though they did surprise her. She thought they would have killed each other before they turned on her, and she realized how foolish such a thought was. Of course they turned on the woman first. She must be extra careful with Calumny. This was a good reminder. And she should start propping a chair against the handle of her door. It'd at least give her a moment to prepare.